Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. It's a Ukraine War Frontline update for the 23rd of September 2024, just going not too, in the not too distant future into the 24th. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. I've just spent sort of 3 hours doing this map update, and my goodness, it takes a lot of time. It's great that JR and Bennypie, I think, are able to automate the mapping, much of what I do with the mapping, which would save me a huge amount of time, a lot of pins and map jiggery pokery. For example, when you look at somewhere like here, each pin and each movement takes an awful long time. That's like 45 minutes work just there. It is fairly significant work often goes into this, and I just often just go over them really quickly. But that's the nature of the beast. Apologies that there's a little label that follows my cursor at the moment. Really frustrating. Don't know why Google Earth is doing that. Right, we're going to go to Kursk. There it is. Going to go to Kursk to begin with, and it's been a bit of push and shove there, but it's become much more positional as far as I can work out, and that's why No Reports has stopped doing, it seems, the daily Kursk thread, because there's not enough information coming out of there. It's not dynamic enough. Now, this is a 3-day mapping update, so these are the changes that have taken place over 3 days, and that's why there's quite a few. When we get further down south in the eastern front line, there are some massive areas of land, relatively speaking, that have been lost to the Russians, and that's something of a worry. But remember, it is 3 days. According to Surrey Maps, the pro-Russian mapper, the Ukrainians have actually had some success pushing up north of the border in a couple of places that we knew about already, but Surrey Maps just seems to think that the Russians have been pushed back and the Ukrainians robustly control this land much more than Andrew Perpetua, who has just that area under Ukrainian control. The Ukrainians controlling all of this and a little bit more from what they had, this extra bit, as according to Surrey Maps. And that, I mean, for Andrew Perpetua, this is all grey zone. So it's probably fairly dynamic around here, where the Ukrainians are pushing into Russian territory. It's worth noting that you have the same river that comes along here. Okay, so it goes, it comes down here and doglegs around. And that's something I haven't really been talking to you about before. I've been talking about this being this rectangle that the Ukrainians are pushing up from the south, possibly pushing in from the west, although the same river comes down here and goes into Ukraine, and that's why the Ukrainians have been able to largely control this area to the west of the River Seine there, because there's no point in the Russians being there. It's too difficult. It's the Ukrainian border just there, so they've ceded that to the Ukrainians, and the river goes up here and along here, but it actually doglegs up to the north here. So how the Russians have been able to get in to attack here isn't coming across the river. It's actually coming down here through Koronovo and then hitting here. So what the Ukrainians could have been trying to do, but I just don't know if they've got enough to be able to do that, is, let's see if I can actually try and draw this. So if we have the river, we put that in a nice turquoise here. So the river sort of comes up there and then sort of comes along here and goes up there. And then we have the Russians trying to get into here and move in that direction. It's been a long time since I've drawn some nice lines on here. And then the Ukrainians coming up from here and here, trying to get to Glushkovo, to the river, cut off the Russians stuck here, but also possibly push into the Russian rear and get them cut off around here. But I don't think that's particularly possible. The Russians able to come in there. So the idea would have been possibly to push the Russians back here all the way to the river, so that they could cut these Russians off that are working, moving to the east there. But I just don't know that the Ukrainians have too much left in the tank, what kind of resources they're able to throw into Kursk, given that how difficult it is elsewhere on the front line. There's a lot of resentment maybe that the Ukrainians are putting a lot of effort into this Kursk area of Russia. But yeah, you've got all these Russians in here that could have been cut off, but I don't think the Ukraine really, you want to be throwing like 50,000 troops into clearing this area out, and of course that's not what the Ukrainians have. But anyway, that river coming down there gives this corridor that the Russians can come down through Koroneva, and that's why I think Koroneva would have been this prime place to take. So you got the same river there. If they could have cut this area off over there, then that would probably have blocked in the Russians here. But Koroneva was just, I guess, too much for the Ukrainians there. Now, one report in the Kursk area is that, and this is coming from the Russian mill blogger Romanov, there are mass lootings. We'd heard this before, but it's interesting to hear this from a prominent Russian mill blogger. Mass lootings by Russian forces taking place in the Koronevsky district, so that's just where we were, and not only in the Kursk region. He added that there's not enough military personnel to address the situation. It's just pretty damning of the Russian, I guess, characteristics here, that as soon as the law goes, as soon as this is a kind of war zone, all the rules go out the window and it's everyone for themselves, and they start looting. The Russian army comes in to help and they loot the area. Locals have been looting, whereas when we saw the equivalent in Ukraine at the beginning of the war, everyone was uniting together and looking out for each other. It's just not what has happened in Russia, and that's an accusation there from Russians themselves. Now, in the Kursk salient itself, we have a couple of areas, according to Surat Mats, where the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians back here, but there's quite a big difference between the mappers anyway. So I don't know that that's something that's really happened over the last 3 days. It's more likely that here's a bit of creeping agreement from Surat Mats with what Andrew Perpetua already has, which is the Russian forces having a robust defensive line much further to the north here. It's quite a bit of difference between these two mappers. In the deepest place, that is almost 5 kilometers worth of difference, which is saying something. And when we come to the west, we see this whole area here, this whole sector here, the Ukrainians have been pushed back. I don't know why that blue line, they've got a random triangle there. The Ukrainians have been pushed back here. The Russians are moving through the western part of the salient, and that is something of a worry for the Ukrainians there. Further to the north, a tiny bit of gain for the Russians, as according to Andrew Perpetua, in the Kamyshovka settlement that's just to the north of the salient there. Okay, that's Kursk for you. So we're going to come down. There are no changes to Vovchansk, as according to Institute for the Study of War, for example. No movement there according to the mappers. When we look at the Vovchansk area, remember that we've had this central area cleared out by the Ukrainians, as according to, geolocated footage of shelling by the Russians. So the Russians are shelling here. So the Russians are definitely not there, but Surat Maps has not changed their mapping to reflect that. And that's often the case, like I often criticise. Surat Maps is quick to show Russian gains, but not very quick to show Russian losses and moving back. When we go to the Institute for the Study of War to look at their synopsis of this area, we go up to here. So a Ukrainian officer operating in the Kharkiv direction stated on September the 22nd that Russian forces are switching to defensive operations in the area and are transferring Storm Z convict recruits from former Wagner group personnel to the area. So interesting, both defensive but also starting to get some Storm Z in, so that would indicate that they'd go on the assault. They don't really use Storm Z for defensive operations so much. Anyway, the spokesman for the Ukrainian brigade operating in the Kharkiv direction said that Russian forces continue attritional infantry assaults with small groups, and that convict recruits and former Wagner group personnel only receive a few weeks training before conducting the assaults. The spokesman stated that Ukrainian forces occasionally advance in unspecified areas in the Kharkiv direction, and that Russian forces have not conducted large-scale assaults in this direction for several weeks. And that is fairly evident from the lack of movement on the map other than in favour of the Ukrainians, and one would understand that probably because a lot of the troops, the more decent troops, have gone up to the Kursk area, and they're bringing in these poorly trained convict troops to, I guess, try and do a sort of active defence maybe by keeping the Ukrainians on their toes, throwing the occasional convict assaults at them. Okay. Going to Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea, we have some gains for the Russians in the Pischane area. They're getting ever closer to the Oskil River, which is very, very worrying for the Ukrainians. Although you could argue that actually it's fine for the Russians to take this land, because it's the Oskil River really that's the main defensive area, 3.5 kilometers from there. A little gain to the north, as according to Andrew Perpetua, just a sort of tiny little tree line there. And then I'm not putting as many pins for Suriyat maps as I normally would to save time, but that indicates that kind of this area has been taken by the Russians in the Pischane area. So when we look at the Institute for the Study of War, we have geolocated footage published on the 21st indicates that Ukrainian forces recently regained limited positions along windbreaks west of Kislivka, northwest of Svatovo. So that is here. The Russian drone strikes, which means that a Russian drone striking Ukrainian infantry means the Ukrainian infantry are here. It doesn't necessarily mean they have taken that land robustly, but they are certainly there. And that is in Kislivka, which is up here, which would suggest that's interesting. So that is in Russian-held territory. So that would suggest that Suriyat maps is incorrect there. So it's definitely not Russian-held territory. It would be grey zone, more likely. So interesting that has been geolocated to show that actually the Ukrainians are attacking still in certain places. They're not just in full-on defensive mode. But when we come further to the south, we come to a place called Nevska and Makivka. This is slightly worrying. The Russians are making some, according to Suriyat maps, some really quite large-scale gains here. Now, in Nevska, supposedly a flag was raised there by the Russians. So that's worrying for those Ukrainians in the area. Some really large-scale gains there, and some smaller gains inside Makivka to take the whole of Makivka there, as according to the Russians. When we come to Institute for the Study of War, they say Russian mill bloggers claimed on September the 21st and 22nd that Russian forces operating northwest of Crimea have seized most of Makivka and have entered Nevska, but that reports of Russian forces seizing Novolyubivka, and we'll look at that immediately west of Nevska, are false. The Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces are counter-attacking near Novolyubivka to slow the Russian advances. So when we look at Nevska, we've got this small settlement, Novolyubivka, and that could be where the Ukrainians are putting up some more resistance, that they've just ceded Nevska and Makivka to the Russians. It's been a long time for them to take those two settlements. They've been working on them for an awful long time, going towards Makivka, since a long while back. And this is, remember, the grey line here is the 30th of May 2023. That was what the line was. You can see how much the Russians have taken in a year and a bit. So obviously May 2023 is when the Ukrainians went for their big counteroffensive, and the Russians have since had their counteroffensive, which is possibly going to be culminating fairly imminently with the onset of autumn and the weather, the onset of the very bad weather and the mud. So a lot of ground up there near Pischane, some near Sinkivka and Kupiansk, and then fairly consistent gains all along the northeastern front down to this area where actually the Ukrainians have done slightly better job of keeping the Russians in check. So that's around Torska and Terny there. Anyway, the Russian flag was hoisted in Nevska, so that's a bit of geolocation for that there. I won't need to check that out for you. Nevska's there. It's going to be somewhere in that settlement. Okay. Coming further to the south, no changes in Serebyansky Forest. Bilohorivka, the Siversk front line, which is good news there. A tiny gain for the Ukrainians here, as according to Suriyat maps, are pushing them back here. Slight difference between Andrew Perpetua and Suriyat maps. Andrew still has that area under the Russian control, but Suriyat maps not so much. So good news there. It could just be a rejig rather than a counterattack, who knows. Quite stable in Chasiv, all things considered, which is good news for the Ukrainians, because you would want to keep that where it is so that this doesn't become a kind of staging point to attack places like Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, and so on and so forth. So keeping them there has been good. I think the Ukrainians have done an absolutely magnificent job there. Although, it's not looking too good in Toretsk and New York, where the Russians are making some fairly considerable gains. Again, that's 3 days worth of gains, but you can see if you draw an imaginary line here with these pink ones, that's where Andrew Perpetua had the Russians. They've now moved up and have moved, according to him, right into this part of Tourette's, right near this central road coming through. And that, definitely not good news for the Ukrainians there. As far as Surat maps are concerned, a smaller area up here. This whole set of blocks over there, and then this tailings heap here down to the south of Touretsk. Are the 3 areas that they suggest the Russians are now in control of. And then we have, quite a few more gains between Touretsk and New York here, where Andrew Perpetua has the Russians further forward, but not nearly as far as Surat Maps already has them. I mean, this is a considerable difference here between the mappers. If you think that just here, that is almost 2 kilometers worth of Touretsk under Russian control, according to Surat Maps, but not as according to Andrew Perpetua. And the difference would undoubtedly be grey zone. And down in this area, again, 2 kilometers worth of difference over here. So fairly considerable. And actually, really big difference in New York itself. So Surat Maps claiming that the Russians have extended their control all the way up north of New York towards Shebnivka. That is definitely a concern. I mean, goodness me, this is not good for the Ukrainians in this area. Now, that's not yet reflected in Andrew Perpetua's mapping that just has a smaller area of New York under the Russian control here, and not as charitable further north of New York, or of northern New York and north of New York over there. So that is one of the areas of the most widespread changes on the front line, and that had stabilized somewhat. Touretsk and New York, the Ukrainians have sent reinforcements in there and they did stabilize that. But now it seems that the Russians are finding some new momentum there. Now, worryingly, they're moving towards Pokrovsk, where they had been stabilized for some time as well. So where we had seen the northern part of the Pokrovsk region stabilized, and actually the Russians have not made any advances here, any meaningful advances here, for a good number of weeks. They still haven't reached the T0504 highway. They're still stuck at Zhizhenka there, but further over towards Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk itself, both mappers claiming that the Russians have basically got full control of Hrodivka, which is a fairly sizable settlement there, and they seem to have taken that relatively easily. I mean, they did get bogged down a little bit, but they've now taken that, according to both mappers. And then further to the south at Krasnoyar here, where the is that right, Krasny Yar, where the Russians are pushing on through Krychy Yar, according to Surat Maps, and then further to the north towards Mykolaiivka there. So problem here for the Ukrainians too. Pokrovsk is just a real issue for them, but like I said yesterday, it's the micro versus the macro. Can they afford to cede territory to the Russians as long as they are not taking the massive losses that the Russians are, and in terms of personnel and equipment? But there are some claims that the Ukrainians are losing fairly heavy numbers of troops in this area, and it's got to be massively attritional for them. Novohrodivka, the Russians have also made some gains in this area. Some, I think, again, tailings heaps there, these big mounds of, if we go to 3D, hopefully it will show that. Yeah, actually this is a somewhat smaller one, but you can see that they might either side might gain either defensive or offensive advantage from controlling high ground like that. But the problem is, it's also becomes, you also stick out like a sore thumb if you've got mortar crew on top of one of those. Okay, going further to the south there, but around Selidove, the Russians have taken some fairly substantial fields south of that settlement, according again to Surat Maps, not to Andrew. And likewise, with only Surat Maps claiming this, south of Ukrainsk, on the way to this place Parallel, the Russians have taken some serious ground on the outskirts of that town. So there are so many towns, villages and towns here that the Russians are just fairly consistently taking and moving on towards. A slight rejig perhaps over here. There's this big pocket of land that the Russians haven't advanced in, which is quite surprising. I would have thought they'd equalise there. So that's going to get dangerous if the Ukrainians still remain in this area and the neck of the cauldron, the neck of that sack gets closed more and more. Now, to the south of that pocket, the Russians making some really substantial gains, as according to Andrew Perpetua, although that was something that Surrey Maps had already claimed. So this is now largely an agreement between the two mappers with all of this area here under control of the Russians. As they have moved, if you remember, this is Mariinka moving on to onto Herivka, isn't it? Yes, Herivka, there it is. And then onto Maximilianivka there. Now, according to Surrey Maps, the Russians have made some interesting polygons of control over here to the west of Horstray and taking control over this this area there. I'm not quite sure what that is. It looks like you've got railway connection. Oh no, that could be something like a prison or a training ground. I don't know. I'd have to. I don't know the translation of that. But anyway, that is under Russian control, according to Surrey Maps, but not Andrew Perpetua. So some fairly considerable differences between the mappers in a number of these places. Now, if we go to Pobieda, there have been some really large-scale attacks by the Russians in a few of these locations towards Krakow, Pobieda here. If we look at this, we have some footage here from NOL reports in the Pokrovsk direction. Russian forces attempted to storm Ukrainian positions near the village of Pobieda for 2 consecutive days, deploying 27 units of equipment and a company of personnel. Ukrainian forces from the 33rd Mechanized Brigade successfully defended their positions, reportedly destroying 16 Russian vehicles and eliminating 60 Russian servicemen. So this is, good news for the Ukrainians. It's attritional. The Russians are losing huge amounts of people and equipment, no doubt, but they are still able to sustain those losses and just have this consistent grind onwards. And the amount of land that they have taken over the last 3 or 4 months here has been really considerable, especially picking up pace in places like Vuhledar, where the last 3 days have shown some really impressive advances for the Russians here. Getting to that road, basically controlling the entirety of that road that connects Vuhledar, bypasses Vodyanya and goes up to Konstantinivka there. They have gained more and more land here, the Russians, and are getting closer and closer to Vuhledar, which is now becoming essentially encircled as they are moving up slowly from the south through Pavlivka. This is uphill, remember. The advantage for Vuhledar is it has these really robust apartment blocks that overlook from this high ground, overlook most of the area around it. That's been a real advantage for shooting downhill towards the Russians here, and that's what has essentially stopped the Russians from taking the land. So the Russians instead eventually decided to come from the north along the equally high ground here and come down this road, and they've succeeded in doing that. So I think the days of Ukrainian control of Vuhledar are very much numbered, and I think they'll be pulling out there, especially as to its west they have crossed the river here and are now north of that and in the grounds to the west of Vuhledar, which is detailed to some extent in the Institute for the Study of War, that says geolocated footage published on September 22nd indicates that the Russian forces advance in fields northwest of Pavlivka. Russian and Ukrainian sources stated that Russian forces crossed the Kashlahach River west of Vuhledar. So that's there, northwest of Pavlivka, in these fields, crossing the river. This is a worry. Both mappers agreeing that the Russians are making those pretty similar advances there. And Vuhledar is going to be under Russian control at some point soon, although it is just completely ruined, of course, as it's not particularly useful for the Russians intrinsically. It is to stop the Ukrainians being able to use this land, really. These are all kind of dominoes for control of this whole area that has allowed the Ukrainians to shoot their HIMARS down at Mariupol. and getting this land will give Mariupol something of a bit of a barrier, a bit of a breather from HIMARS and whatnot. So that is the mapping update for today. There are a number of, I think, significant gains for the Russians. Sorry. The question is it still worth piling in resources to Kursk rather than helping to defend down here? I would still argue it is. I think this territory up here has much greater leverage for the Russians, for the Ukrainians, to the Russians, than their own territory does down here. I don't know. Yeah, I'd be making this up, but you could imagine this might be like a 2-to-1 value. So in other words, this is worth twice as much land down in Ukraine in order for bargaining. So that could be why the Ukrainians are putting the effort into taking land up north of the border rather than putting that same effort into defending land down here. But let me know what you think, whether you are in agreement with that. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.